Okay. Let go of me, a big galoot. Why don't you pick on somebody your own size? They'd hit back. So I guess that has a certain unethical logic to it. So I might learn that it's fine for me to go ahead and to beat up other kids as long as they're little, because then they're not going to fight back, they're not going to hurt me. So it means that the aggressive behavior that I am using, I can come to expect will work under certain circumstances. So I have outcome expectations that aggression will work, especially if I'm with being mean to little kids. In this kind of model, children enter a social situation, they perceive the event, they take in information, they perceive the event, make attributions, their goals are activated, they think of different solutions, and then they're at the point of making a decision about what it is they're going to do. And decisions in this model are stage 5, and they're largely driven by the child's expectations that the different solutions, including aggression, will work in some way. And so for these kinds of children that we've talked about that are more proactive aggressive, the one stage out of all these 6 stages in the model that's most relevant for them is stage 5. So their aggressive behavior is driven by their expectation that aggression is going to work. So if I'm going to reduce proactive aggressive behavior, I need to help them to have different outcome expectations. Right? So that's the link. For reactive aggressive kids, the social information processing characteristics most unique are really those ones at the very beginning of the process. So their tendency to be too hypersensitive to hostile cues and to have these hostile attributional biases. You can also see in terms of other characteristics of reactive aggressive children, these are kids who are more rejected, more disliked by their peers. They have more other kinds of emotional distress. So they're, again, kind of like the run-of-the-mill aggressive kids that many of you probably do work with. I'm going to mention one other thing about social information processing before we go on. It's the distinction between automatic versus deliberate processing. And I think this is the bottom line here has important implications for how we try to intervene with kids. So I'm going to pound you in gym class, Twinkie. Oh, yeah? I'd like to see you try it. It's a great moment of, oh my gosh, what did I just say? And then my brain wishes, my ego had call waiting. Okay? So why do we laugh at this slide? It's because we all do this, right? We all have tendencies with a spouse, coworker, relative, child, whatever, where we say something that we wish we could retract. We wish we could pull it back. But it came out. It was automatic. So this is kind of an automatic process in contrast to a deliberate process where we'd be more thoughtful. So what difference does that make? We know that children in general do use a fair amount of automatic processing. In fact, we all do. It'd be pretty hard to function in day-to-day life unless we had these automatic processes that guide us along, that help us to drive our car without thinking every second of the time and all that. But for aggressive children, they tend to over-rely on this automatic processing. They're impulsive, and they're in that mode more so than their typically developing peers. So in one study, we asked aggressive and non-aggressive children to take that problem-solving measure we just talked about with the vignettes, and we asked one set of kids to wait 20 seconds. "20 seconds is a long time, isn't it? Huh? So there's lots of opportunities for cognitive activity to take place during that 20 seconds. And what we found were that the kids who had taken the 20 seconds versus the ones who responded immediately, the kids who waited 20 seconds are deliberate. In this case, it's the deliberate condition. They endorsed higher rates of verbal assertion, came up with more verbal assertion solutions, and lower rates of direct action, which is great. You know, that's just what we want to see. And you see exactly the same pattern for aggressive and non-aggressive kids, right? So that's really cool because it suggests for many of the children we work with who in the moment, when we first are trying to get them to think about their solutions or when they're enacting solutions and they're pretty action-oriented, if they slow down, they have other ideas somewhere in their head, right? Huge thing, because it means that to the degree that's true for a child, then what I'm trying to do in my intervention work is to encourage the performance of something that's already there versus trying to teach something that's non-existent. Much more difficult task, much harder task. So kind of the typical thing in automatic processing, a child perceives a threat. They go to a memory bin. They go through certain neural paths, get to that memory bin of stored ideas, things they've observed, things they've been told, things they've done in the past that are ways to handle this particular kind of threat. But they're doing this automatically, so you go to that memory bin and you're very quickly going to it, you take what's on top, and then that's what you do. Right? So even though other things are in there. If you're doing deliberative processing, you go to the memory bin and you kind of sift through it. You check and say, oh yeah, that's right, I could just tell them that I need the ball back. That's right, I could do that instead. And then that's what you do. So two implications that are pretty key, I think, for intervention work with these aggressive kids from this. Anybody want to hazard their own thoughts about it? You might have better ideas than me, by the way. Yeah.
Is it that an action took place and they were asked to just wait 20 seconds and then respond to no additional guidance?
They were responding to those vignettes, like the story about Ed and the soccer ball.
Oh.
So they were presented the story stem and just asked to not give any answer.
So they weren't in an emotional state?
They were not. They were not. All right. So you might have some questions about that, and that'd be good, because I can imagine where you go. So implications of this, though. I think there's two things. One, as if we can, the kids that we're working with, if we can get them to be more deliberate, actually they may be able to access some more competent ideas and solutions. If we can get them to slow down at times, right? And then we can reinforce that.
So teaching relaxation and things like that.
Right. So things that help them to manage that surge of arousal. And if you can get that 20 seconds, right, the equivalent of that, it's not huge, just a little bit of time, then the odds are, doesn't guarantee it, but the odds are better choice goes up. But, right, we know these kids, right? So kids on the bus and coming into school in the morning, and some kid comes up to him. So he gets on the bus, and what happens is the kid, this other kid says, "Oh, you're just a real jerk face, you know. You can get out of my face here." And so the kid we're working with, who's the one who's the jerk face, then has to respond, right? Can he wait 20 seconds? Say, well, just a minute, let me think about this. It won't happen, obviously, right? So in many, many cases in their social environment, you cannot, when you're literally in it, you cannot take 20 seconds. You cannot allow that to occur. So what you have to do, so the implication of that is, what we want to do is see the more competent solutions rise to the top of the memory bin. Because we know these kids are still going to be automatic. They're still going to have to do it. In fact, they almost have to for survival purposes. So how do things rise in the memory bin? How do they rise up? Practice and repetition, that's exactly right. So there's tons of cognitive psychology research on exactly this topic, and what it finds is that the way you can make ideas more easily activated is through practice, and it makes sense. You know, what's really happening through practice is you're increasing the strength of the neural connection to that particular idea. And the better, the stronger that neural connection is, the quicker, you know, you can get to it and get out of it. So it's practice. So what the implication is in our work with the kids is that you want to go over and over and over and over the same kind of ideas with them. And these are kids who hate to go over and over the same kind of thing. So, but we know that this is going to be an issue, but that's exactly what we're going to want to do. So what we try to do within the program is to have different kinds of activities. We'll have some discussion things, we'll have some game-like things, we'll have some role play, but our intent with all of that is to give them opportunities to think about and practice the same ideas over and over again, so that then their probability of using verbal assertion goes up. Doesn't guarantee it. So this is kind of what we've talked about this morning so far. We'll go on beyond this. So essentially we talked about a number of risk factors that are out there within the neighborhood and the family that contribute to children's behavior. They primarily have their effect by influencing how parents parent in the moment, and how parents parent affect how kids relate to their peers, and how kids' relations to their peers affects their emerging social cognition and self-regulation. So in the program, what we mostly want to try to deal with is just that middle box. So those are the active mechanisms that we think are changeable. We can manipulate those in some ways within families and kids. Some of these things are not readily able to be manipulated. I'm not going to go into great detail here other than to say that this kind of model of thinking about risk factors implies that the earlier that you intervene, the better, because the later that you wait, there's a developmental stacking of risk factors. So if you start off real early, you don't have as much of the deviant peer group effect because the child's very young. But if you wait later, that's going to come into play. So then you have to have a more massive intervention the later that you wait to intervene. Okay, real quickly over intervention effects, and I know that most of you from raising your hands that you heard me talk about coping power some yesterday in the course of my talk, so I'll go through this quickly. This is just a summary of some of the research that we have done or are doing. And this was a slide that I showed yesterday, and what it indicated was that the effects of this program that we're going to talk about can show up a year after the end of the program. So one of the real big questions is maybe with a program you can have an effect on the child at the time that you're finishing your work with them, but does it stick? How much of it sticks and is still there? So in this study we found that in fact it stuck, and that a year after the end of the program there were reductions in delinquency and substance use for the children who had both the child and the parent component. If the children had just the child component, there were gains in how kids functioned in school, but not significantly in terms of the other domains. So what this would suggest is that actually both things are important. That the child component gives you certain gains, and clearly the parent component helps with other things. So in the ideal world, you would try to do both. A lot of you are in school settings, and in many cases it's a lot easier to do the child part and kind of hard to do the parent part. So, and I'm aware of that tension a lot. And one thing I mentioned yesterday that's really helpful to us is that the teacher ratings we get in that follow-up year are blind. So those teachers do not know, who was in intervention the prior time. So it's blind. So what they see is that those intervened with kids, in fact, were doing better, and we're continuing to do better. But we also know that the parent work seems to have some critical importance for delinquency and substance use. So this is another sample. So we were pleased to see that kind of effect, but with another sample, also from Durham, we again looked at the effects of the same 3 outcomes 1 year after the end of intervention. And in terms of looking at substance use, from baseline to the 1-year follow-up, or 1 year after the end of intervention, there's an increase in substance use for the control kids, and coping power kids kind of stay at about the same level. So it's kind of a prevention effect. It prevents them from moving forward, and that what normally happens to kids at that point. We also had information on self-reported delinquent behavior, get a significant effect there as well at the 1-year follow-up. And then in terms of teacher-rated peer aggressive behavior, the decline in teacher-rated aggression here is steeper for the coping power kids. So really for the same 3 kinds of outcomes, you get the same findings at a 1-year follow-up, which helps me to think that they're probably more true. Pardon me? This is the joint. This includes both the child and the parent program. And this is just showing a longer-term follow-up effect where with this sample, we've looked further out to a 3-year time point. And the more darker solid line is coping power and shows the teacher ratings continue to go down over a long term. So this is a study with some colleagues in the Netherlands. Walter Matthijs leads this. And so he took coping power, turned it into a Dutch program, and adapted it to some degree for use there. And this is with children who are conduct disordered or oppositional defiant disordered. So while we've used it primarily as a school-based program, this is an example of how it's been used in clinical setting with children who are diagnosed with either ODD or CD. And what Walter found was that at the end of the intervention, so children came into their clinic, they were randomly assigned to care as usual or to coping power. And care as usual in that clinic, this was a clinic associated with the University Medical Center there, was fairly broad. And in some cases actually was cognitive behavioral therapy. So not too much different than what we do. But in other cases, it was different. At the end of the intervention, there were 2 things I think that were most important that they found. One is, right at the end, was that the intervention helped to produce reductions in overt hostile behavior in children. So kind of more overt stuff. And it was more cost-effective than traditional therapy. We also had some funding where he went back and looked at things 4 years after the end of intervention. So again, thinking about this really quite long-term outcomes at a much later point. And so this is care as usual here, and that's the Utrecht Coping Power Program, the Dutch version. And at this later time point, there were significant reductions for coping power in tobacco use and marijuana use. The effect on alcohol use was not there. These are obviously exactly the same. And all of these rates were within the same range as rates for typically developing adolescents in the Netherlands. Okay, so this is just summarizing, this slide is just summarizing those effects. So one thing that we have done that I didn't show here was a mediation study. So given that there were those nice effects on 1-year follow-ups, we came back and had a paper in 2002 where we looked at a panel of 5 mediational variables that might mediate the effects. And these included a measure of children's hostile attributions, a measure of their outcome expectations, measure of their locus of control, how internal did they feel about making decisions, and of inconsistent parenting. And we found that intervention produced changes on that package of mediators, and that it was really the change in that package of mediators that produced the better effect on the outcome in terms of actually all 3 of these outcomes: delinquency, substance use, and school behavior. So it suggests that the intervention, to have an effect, amongst other things, has to change these kind of things, like hostile attributions and outcome expectations. So this is the other study, one of the other studies I mentioned yesterday. I'm just not going to go through it in great detail other than just to summarize this particular slide. So if you remember this from yesterday, those of you who saw it, those of you who didn't, we had a total of 57 elementary schools in Alabama, most of them from the Birmingham City school system. And the counselors who were at these schools were randomly assigned to one of three conditions. They either had a control or care as usual condition, or they were in a intensively training condition where they were intensively trained to use coping power, or they received basic training in coping power. And the children who had intensively trained counselors had significant reductions in their aggressive behavior, externalizing behavior, according to teachers, parents, and then kids themselves. So across all three outcomes. The kids also had improvements in their social and academic behaviors. Their leadership skills improved. Their social skills improved. And they had reductions in their outcome expectations. They were less likely to think that aggression would work. So then a key variable we've talked about, for stage 5. If you look at counselors who received the more simple training, the effects were different. So there were improvements in the kids' positive behaviors, but not significant changes in their negative behaviors. So I think that's an important issue where the intensity of training makes a difference, and the issue is how do you match training to also people's needs. So in this particular case, we were training school counselors who only about 20% of whom had had any experience with manualized treatments before and had very limited exposure to cognitive behavioral interventions. So they were having to learn a lot, at that point. My guess would be, but this is an empirical study, so if any of you like empirical studies, it's going to be how much intensity of training is needed for people who have different levels of prior experience. So a lot of you have already prior experience with cognitive behavioral work. Well, you wouldn't need the same level. But one of the implications of this, I think, that I do take away, and we do talk a lot about, is that it's helpful, I think, to have something in addition to the workshop. So the more that there's some kind of follow-up opportunities to problem solve about how the program is being implemented, or if it's possible to even have audio or videotapes of sessions kind of reviewed, that helps people in their administration of the program. We also talked about this other issue about how personality characteristics and school characteristics relate to the implementation of the program. And the storyline here was, so we had these measures of the personality features. So it's okay to be neurotic, not particularly open-minded, not particularly extroverted, and cynical if you're in the right work environment. But the things that did predict were that the more conscientious someone is, the more likely you are to work with a manualized intervention. And I think this whole issue of agreeableness is really fascinating to me, what that means. So agreeableness as a personality dimension is related to flexibility and being able to manage stressful, difficult events. And I think the more that I, as a clinician, have that, I'm probably modeling that to children, helping them develop those skills. So I think, not surprisingly, there's some of our own features that make a difference, and the work setting makes a difference. So if we're in work settings that are that burn us out, that don't permit much professional autonomy, that don't honor us as professionals, it's harder for us to implement programs in the way that is optimal. So.
And in the current economic situation,
yeah, in terms of there being reductions in personnel or services, yeah. So there's lots of stresses going on in that environment right now, I think. Yep. So that gets us to the Coping Power Program. As you know, there are two manuals, as we've talked about, one for the child, one for the parent. And there's 2 workbooks. So we got the workbook here for you to take on the, which has handouts and such for the child group. And then there's a parallel one that goes along for the parent group. So we didn't bring copies of that, but if anybody's interested, we can share some of those with you. The copies of the program are available in 2 primary ways. You can also go through Amazon.com and those kind of things. But Oxford University Press is the publisher of these manuals. There's a section, there's a thing within Oxford University Press that's called Programs That Work. They also have something called Treatments That Work. And so we're collected within that set of books. We also have, through Lochman Corporation, which is a corporation that Mike Nelson and I have for disseminating these kind of things, some of these available. So it's www.lochnels.com. And so if you do have any questions about getting other materials or something, you can just contact us or go through there. If you do have questions about wanting to talk with us or chat with us about follow-up training opportunities after the workshop, we're quite happy to do that. And you can either talk to Carolyn or I through this phone number or through these websites will get us to the center, and then there's a spot, right? Yeah, okay. Okay, so let's talk about the program a bit here. So this program, as it's prepared, as it's written, is optimal for children ages 8 to 14. Be happy to talk with you about extensions of the program, either younger or older. And we do train people who have used it with younger children. And many of the program elements can be used with younger children. They just have to be made progressively more concrete, depending upon the age. They can also be used with children who are somewhat older than 13 or 14. And we're working with some colleagues right now in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins, and we're creating an early adolescent version of Coping Power. But I'd say probably about 80 or 90% is the same as what we have here. Well, there are things that are different. It's about how to deal with damaged relationships and some topics like that that are a little bit more sophisticated that we don't have in here. But if any of you are interested in that, in thinking about adjusting down, below, or up or above this range, we'd be happy to talk with you about that. Yeah.
Has Coping Power ever been implemented like in an alternative ed setting, education settings, where children have been expelled like from traditional general education?
It's definitely been used in special ed settings, probably in alternative ed, although we don't have any research data on it. But we've trained people who've used it in a variety of settings, so including things like inpatient. They've used it in inpatient settings. They've used it in after-school programs where you can do it several times a week, more intensively, in that kind of way.
Has it been used in high school?
I don't know about specifically high schools. Do you know?
In New York State, clinicians use it in high school age clients, but normally in the outpatient setting rather than in.
So used it with high school kids, but in their outpatient clinics. So this was an initiative in the last 2 years where we trained 800 clinicians in the state of New York. So their cases were mostly being seen in their offices rather than in school. Okay, we've talked about this issue that there can be these comorbid secondary diagnoses, so we're not surprised when they show up, ADHD in particular. So the issue for ADHD with this program is that even in the intervention trials, we don't diagnose for it at the beginning. But if we're aware from our experience that this is a child who looks pretty ADHD, we're going to advise the parents to consider an ADHD, evaluation. And my own experience is that for kids who have a high level of hyperactivity and impulsivity, it's harder for them to get something out of the program. So if they can begin to have some of that under control, they're going to be more attentive and they're going to get more out of the program as they go along. There's a variety of behavior management strategies. So coping power is one that we talk about. This is a cognitive behavioral program, and we really mean the behavioral, especially for these kids. There needs to be clarity about consequences and points to make things work here. So we do have a token economy built into the system, or a point system, and we'll talk about that. It's critical that we as leaders, we as therapists, provide frequent labeled praise for positive behavior during sessions. So everything that we're trying to teach our parents to do, we need to do, and it's hard, and I'm as much as anybody else, where especially if you're working with a group of kids, they're very active, you're trying to set up activities, you're trying to prepare for the next one, and various little fires are going on here. So it's hard to be at the top of my game and to really pick up all of those positive things that some of the kids are doing, but it's so critical. So, it's an important thing to try to do as you're going along. Leader models problem solving and emotion management skills. The more that we can illustrate these skills in modeling, both in terms of kind of a modeled role play and even through our own day-to-day activity with the kids, the more likely it is they pick it up and use it. We're going to talk about the management system that we use. The kids help to generate the rules. We use warning strikes. At the very end of the session, there's going to be a positive feedback time just before we end the group. And then there's an incentive system with the prize box that is used. Yeah.
Now, are these things that, I know that you're doing it in a clinical setting and things like that. What we do is we incorporate a lot of these things for the teachers that are working with children day to day.
Yeah.
An inclusive setting, not necessarily
Right.
just with children with disabilities.
Sure.
For me, anyway. So would this be something that it could be kind of managed by, say, like an early childhood program staff that has a child who's kind of demonstrating some behavior issues, or after school, or?
You mean in the classroom, or by the staff pulling out kids?
An economy.
Yeah.
Talk about incentive system.
Right.
Talk about children generating rules.
So your question is, could it be used though in a larger group, essentially in the group of 5 to 6 children? So in the research, and what we've done is to do this in small groups. So it's 5 to 6 kids. Some of our counselors have had more. They are comfortable working with 7, 8 kids, so a little bit bigger groups. But there are always those. We have followed up counselors, though, including the ones who were in that field trial, the ones where we found out that agreeableness and conscientiousness were good. And we found that on their own, some number of those counselors were using this program in their prevention activities in the full classroom. So, I do think that parts of the program can be used in a full classroom setting, but we don't have the data on it. So, but we're aware people have done that. So the typical format, though, so what I'll talk about is the typical format. We have all these other atypical variations, though. Classroom, we've also are using it and have used it individually, one-to-one. But I'm going to talk about the group format as the prototype. So 5 to 6 children. It'd be nice if there were 2 leaders, but certainly one therapist could run the group. Depends on the system you have. We have found that including periodic one-to-one sessions, brief sessions, 20 to 30-minute sessions with the children in the group helps. It helps in 2 primary ways. One is these are kids that sometimes are hard to engage. They're oppositional defiant, or on that rank. So having this one-to-one contact where the kids are out of the group dynamic and the group peer pressure can help the kids, in many cases, to relate to me in a more positive way. And when I can have a few of those positive interactions with kids, then it's easier to give feedback and to affect their behavior in the group. So it's a relationship building thing, and it's also an opportunity to individualize the problem-solving work and other things we're doing to a particular child's problems, really emphasizing certain things with them. And we also work with the teachers throughout the project. So why do we do this within groups? Why would we even do that rather than just do it individually? Of course, many of you are in school, so it might be hard to do it individually, but for practical reasons. But if you're in a clinic setting, you really could go either way. And there are some, even though there's difficulties or concerns with groups, there also are some clear benefits. So in a group, you can have a child model an appropriate way of managing their anger for another child, and that can be very effective, can be very influential. What the child's going to remember out of that session is what that peer did, more than what I did or what I said. The peers can provide social reinforcement, and they do in a well-functioning group. They encourage each other for getting points. If we're in a group, we can actually do role-playing with kids. If I'm doing one-to-one work, I can do role-playing with the child and me, but that's not quite like what their real social interactions are like. And it makes treatment more efficient. Some of the concerns about groups are that the kids can have negative reactive effects on each other. There can be some kids within a group that have oppositional power struggles with me, and they love to do it. And there can be a deviant peer group. So there's at least the possibility that I could make the kids worse. Right? Do I need to say that again? I could make the kids worse by working with them in a group. So you have to really think about that a lot when you're doing group work with these kind of kids. And so what it means is I have to become more like, in some ways, the very best teacher that I can remember when I was a kid. The kind of teacher who had eyes in the back of their head, who really monitored things very well all the time, could sense when there's slight disturbances in the force around me, that things are beginning to happen, and could intervene quickly, could distract and move to a different activity, who handles transitions from one activity to another just smoothly, flawlessly, and especially does not allow unstructured time. So, yes?
That's a very important issue that you're bringing up, because there is discrepancy of opinions as to whether anger management groups are okay or not.
Absolutely.
So I think what you're saying is that it depends.
Yes.
It's not an absolute no.
Right.
And it depends on the quality of the leader, on a small group composition, and these other things, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we're involved with a study, Carolyn and I, with Tom DeShawn, I think I might have mentioned it yesterday, where we're actually testing this group intervention versus a one-to-one intervention. And Tom DeShawn is the kind of famous person in the country for doing this kind of research. And one of the things that we're wanting to do is we have video recordings of each session, and we're going to code for kid behavior in terms of the kinds of things they do to train each other in a deviant way. But in particular, we're going to code for what therapists do. So I think we can learn from therapists what are the best ways of handling these kind of interchanges. So in the course of planning this grant, Tom and our group has done a lot of brainstorming. We've thought about what are these kind of likely behaviors that make a difference. That's what we're coding for, and it includes some of these things we were just talking about. The parallel that I take is that what it is that we're trying to train our parents to do is exactly what we need to do. So we're trying to train our parents to set very clear expectations and provide clear instructions that are brief, unambiguous. We should do the same thing. There should be clear setups for consequences if a direction is not appropriately attended to. We should do the same thing. We should be ready for this labeled praise, just like we want parents to do. The same thing. Yep.
Some people have looked at including pro-social peers in these groups as a strategy for managing those notions. Curious what your thoughts are on that. I personally
Yeah. Well, the research I don't think is very clear. And one of the common findings is that when there is a deviancy training effect in a group, who it affects the most is the least aggressive. They get bumped up. And so that's a danger. And actually a colleague of mine, John Cooey, when I was at Duke, we ran a summer day camp, and we had never done this before. We weren't Bill Pelham, at that point. And one thing that we found was that the program helped the kids who were aggressive, but we had non-aggressive kids, and they actually got more aggressive during that summer. And it eventually kind of evened out a year later. But so I'm not convinced. The evidence is unclear, I think. Yeah.
Just wondering how you control the kind of before the group starts and after the group finishes, because isn't there some evidence that it's actually there's really good work in the group by controlling all those things, but it's when those kids are hanging out after
Oh, yeah.
and before the group. I think Jerry Patterson talks about that.
Yep.
So how do you manage that since they're not kind of hanging out together on the way home?
Well, so it depends on how, of course, you're setting up the group. If it's at school, then the kids have to go after the group. They have to go back to a classroom setting. So the monitoring period is them in the hall, getting back there, and there could be problems there, but they are expected to be somewhere else. So there's the school structure that kind of protects against that a little bit. There's still some opportunities. You still have to be planful, make sure there's not deviant talk occurring, in that time before and after. If it's done in an after-school program where kids would maybe be going home alone, then I think that could be an issue. A therapy group at a clinic, it could be an issue. So there, you just have to be more vigilant, I think, and have to be aware. If, let's say it's a therapy group at a clinic, you would want to make sure that you understand how kids are going to be taken home after the group. Are their parents coming, or are they kind of free to run around? And it could be a problem. So actually, John Curry and I, who you heard yesterday, when he was at Duke, he had a grant at one time where he was going to develop a program for substance-using, depressed adolescents who were comorbid for both things. And so this was an outpatient clinic, and there were some pilot groups that were being run, and I was one of the consultants on it. And what they found in the group, these were kind of like 8th or 9th grade kids, something like that, maybe even 10th grade. And there would be this break time in the middle of the group, and they would have like 10 minutes where they could kind of have their own time. And what he observed was at one time was that several of the kids go outside and they're smoking, and one of the guys and one of the girls are making out there. So if you give free rein, things happen. So it does require planful anticipation. Yes.
And I don't know if you've said this already, but when you're providing, say, in a school setting, you're providing the study and doing all of these things. Now, is this something that then you partner with the teachers that are there to be able to implement some of these strategies? So if there is something that pops up, then these interventions are put in place to see if it is working not only in that setting, but in other?
In the classroom, you mean? Yeah. So ideally, that's exactly right. We'd want to be consulting with the teacher, so they're going to be aware of the behaviors that we're working on. We want them to monitor them, and then we would be consulting with them about what kind of management system they're using in the classroom.
So there are certain triggers within the classroom that are kind of setting off.
Absolutely. I mean, we want to know that. And we want to know that, and we want to give them feedback about it. Yep. So there's huge advantages for doing intervention work in schools. And that's at that end. It's harder to get parents engaged, so that's the downside. But the actual work with the kids, I think, you can actually do better work, more straightforward work with the kids. So these are issues when you're starting your group. You want to think about what this group composition is going to be like, especially if you have opportunities to put together a group. You want to be particularly careful about kids whose aggression provides them with high peer status and don't express any motivation to change. It doesn't mean that they couldn't work with you. It's just that their probability of becoming a difficult group member is up. So you have to be careful about that as part of a group. Children who are substantially different from the proposed pool of group members. So we try to avoid singletons. So a single girl in a group of boys, or a single boy in a group of girls. In kind of our communities, where our communities, the ethnic issues are mostly, for the most part, Caucasian and African American. We try to avoid having one African American in an otherwise white group, one white child in an otherwise African American group. Developmental level is really important. So if you get a group of kids who are pretty average and then one who's much lower, it's going to be hard to respond to the needs of the lower functioning child. Children who are likely to pose substantial challenges to group behavior management. Children who are targets for ridicule by other group members. So this is one I think you really have to think about carefully. So you may know that there's a bully-victim pair in your school, and if you put them in the group, at least some of that dynamic is going to show up, and you have to be just thoughtful about that. Are you going to be able to handle that in that group? And at least in general, at least low average intellectual functioning would be our estimate for this. These are the outlines of the sessions, and I'm not going to go over great detail about just the numbers and all that, because we're going to talk about some of the session content in a moment. But you can kind of look at the general sequence. So we start off at the very beginning, kind of getting the group going. We talk about goals, and then a little bit on organizational and study skills, and then move first into feelings and emotion awareness, and then emotion management. And then later on, we have a bunch of sessions on problem-solving skills, and that's done very much on purpose, because we think that kids are not able to use problem-solving skills very well if they don't have at least some control over their arousal. So they can have okay problem-solving skills, but their problem perhaps is that their emotion is flooding their ability to process. So the first step for us is to work on that, on the arousal part, and then to come back later and deal with the more cognitive problem-solving part. Okay. So in terms of this first part of the program, behavioral and personal goal setting, we have a first session, which in some ways I think is similar to many first sessions that you might have, at least in part. So we discuss the purpose and structure of the group, and we talk about what does coping mean. So we actually did have some thought about this whole idea of why call something coping power, and what we wanted to avoid was this is the group for bad kids, or anything that was kind of like that, right? So by focusing on coping, which is your ability to handle stressful things around you, we can normalize that. So we can say that this is an issue for me. It's an issue for all of us, that we all run into difficult situations, and we also often find that it's hard to cope with it, to deal with these difficult situations. So the focus of what we want to have in the kids' mind is that we're going to work on their ability to make good decisions and cope with stressful things in their lives. Generate group rules. We're going to develop a strike system and points. It's going to be a group cohesion task or two. And this is where some of your own favorite tasks can be used, but we can be simple things like passing the ball, where once you receive the ball, you have to say the name of the person that you received it from. Or if you do it several times, you have to eventually say the name of everybody in the group, things like that are, we're part of a group. And that's what we're going to be doing here. And then you begin the goal setting process. So the point system is also introduced for the kids, and there are some points that they can earn within the group. They get 1 point for positive participation. They get 1 point for following rules. And if this is being delivered in the school setting, they get 5 points for each day they meet a behavioral goal. If their goals are in the home setting, that would actually be 7 points, because they get a point a day. And then they can get additional points throughout the program for quizzes and games and homework assignments. So those just kind of crop up. But they usually, for the most part, kids are going to get somewhere between 7 and 9 points or opportunities for that each week. So the first step here is to come up with the group rules. And if you were in my group, if all of you were my group, I'm not going to generate the group rules. I want you to tell me what the rules should be for our behavior in the group. We're going to be meeting together for the next 34 weeks or whatever, and we need to come to a decision about what the rules are going to be for our behavior. And how many of you do that, incidentally, as part of your intervention for what you do? Does anybody find that that doesn't work very well? So my experience is 95% of the time, kids are incredibly interactive and compliant with this task, even the ODD kids, because this is something that they know about. They know rules because they know how they break them, but they know what the rules are. They know the rules, and they can generate them, and they can do generally a pretty good job of talking about key rules. So what we want to end up with is about 5, 6, 7 rules. Really no more than that, because you're not going to remember more than that. And we will take the rules they get and put them on a poster, and we'll bring that back to each session. So it kind of helps them to remember, but you still don't want a huge number of rules. And if they don't come up with some rules, we're going to put them in. So if they don't put up a rule related to not hitting other people in the group or something like that, we're going to put that in there. So something about physical aggression is just clearly not acceptable. It just will not occur. We also will typically have a rule about not interrupting other people or letting other people to talk, something like that. So, and the reason for that one is that these are kids who often are kind of hyperactive, and they start to get going, and they start to get buzzed. And then if that starts too much, then it's hard to bring it back down again. So it's better just to have a rule that kind of regulates contributions, and kids are used to that in the classroom, so they usually go along with that. We'll ask them about confidentiality. Do you know what confidentiality means? We want to have a rule about that. And so usually it's only the kids who've been in therapy before who know what that means, and they can tell you. But we will emphasize that. What we say here stays here. Okay? So that, of all the rules, that's one that we cannot observe, actually. Really. I mean, we don't tell them that, but we really can't. But it's such an important issue that we want it to be on that goal sheet in front of them. So everything else are behaviors that are actually in the session. And then the routine thing that we do, yes. So we use a strike system. Usually that's the default. You could use other methods. You all might use other methods. The first time in today's session, so one of you didn't keep your hands and feet to yourself. So that's a strike. You didn't keep your hands and feet to yourself. And so it's a feedback. It's I'm just saying it. I'm labeling what I've done. I've given somebody a strike. I've said why, and then I go on with the task. So it's I want the kids to experience that as I'm giving them feedback rather than some kind of harsh punishment. If same person violates that same rule or another rule, they're going to get strike 2. When they get the third strike, they lose the point for that day. They lose their group rule point. So this is a response cost system. You come into the group session with your point in hand, and you can only lose it. We know that response cost is powerful for kids who have ADHD or problems like this, that they pay attention to it, they respond to it. We also know they can get emotionally activated by it, get upset by it, but yeah.
Just that I understand. So are you saying that if you've got a group that's about 30 minutes in length, and right from the very beginning, Jason is acting inappropriately and now he's earned 3 strikes within the first 5 seconds, he's done?
He will not get his point for group rules. That's exactly right.
So what's the incentive for him?
Good question. Good question. Right.
25 minutes of Zoom.
Right. So actually, the very first version of this group that we ran, we just had this kind of group rule point, and probably in the very first session, we had Jason in there, or somebody who did exactly that. So within this system, that's where the positive participation point at the end comes into play. So you can still get that.
So you can still earn that.
You can still earn that. That's independent. It's an independent decision. And frankly, when we do a positive participation point review, we're pretty liberal, not politically liberal or conservative, but we give a lot of them. So if kids have shown some capacity, might have had a bad beginning of the group or bad portion of the group, but if there was an identifiable part of the group where they positively participated, I'm going to give them that point.
So there's still some kind of avenue for him to be able to get something out of it.
Absolutely.
So there's still some kind of incentive that's built in.
That's right. So they need to know that. They need to know that that can still happen. So that's a good question. Yeah.
What's the limit of the range of ages that kids can have in the same group?
Well, usually, for the research purposes, we're really keeping it kids in the same grade level. So, it's pretty compact except for kids who've been retained or whatever. So you're within a couple of years. I think if you're in a clinic setting, I would still not go much beyond 3 years. And the critical thing is kids who've begun to move into adolescence versus the pre-adolescence. So I'd try to avoid that in particular. But if I had some 9 to 11-year-olds that are not particularly adolescent yet, then that's fine. Okay, these are the strikes here. So we emphasize that the strike that you receive for strike 1 and strike 2 essentially are a warning. That's to sober up. Intentionally give strikes during the first few sessions. Right? So the reason for that is that we are basically nice people. Right? We have a lot of empathy for the kids we work with. And we see them do little things, and we say, well, we know why they're doing it. And we give them the benefit of the doubt. We want them to engage well in the group. So they might violate one of the group rules. We say, well, it's not so bad, and I really want them to hook in. One of the dangers of that is that if that child then has not received any strikes, you're up to session 5, and now the child starts off, and he's really starting to act up. The honeymoon's over. We're starting to see some of the real behavior, and now I'm going to give the strike. Then it's different. It violates the norm that the child has, and they have a much stronger negative affective reaction to that at that point. It's like, you've assaulted me, I haven't had this for 5 sessions, and now you've assaulted me by giving me this strike. So in our experience, it's actually better to be pretty straightforward, giving this pretty even-handed kind of feedback about strikes, starting from the very first session. And then it's just normal. It's not a big deal. It's just what you get. In groups, sometimes it's helpful to have a visual, and this is helpful for the kids, and then also helpful for you just to remember who's got which strikes. So in this kind of a thing here, a little bit hard to read, but you'd have kids' names here in the left-hand column, and then these are little Velcro things, and you would just slap up a strike on there if they get a strike. Or put it up gently, if you prefer that.
Is there a way to have any flexibility within the behavioral chart? I'm a positive behavior support coach.
Yeah.
We would see it the opposite way, in the sense of highlighting the positive. Oh, I love the way Johnny is, and then giving that out and being less. I mean, we're redirecting and providing consequences.
Yeah.
The highlight shown on a chart would be more positive.
Yeah, I think that would be fine. I mean, again, we consider this to be a default system, and it's fairly easy to implement, but there are variations that people use all the time. Sometimes it's driven by the culture of the school and what you're doing there, and sometimes it's just driven by the nature of the kids, because this system is probably not good enough if you have a group of really, really ADHD kids, because they're going to violate the rules. All of them are going to violate the rules in the first 3 minutes. And so there you have to break it down because of the frequency of the behavior into much smaller segments into 5 or 10 minute segments throughout the group, and then give them feedback. But I think your point is well taken that it could be. But even if you had that, I think you'd still have some group rules that are violations that cannot be permitted. They have to know that certain things are the equivalent of house rules. They're not going to happen. So these are some of the get acquainted activities, questions that you could use. Obviously, you all have your favorites. So we begin the discussion of goal setting here in this first session, and then it's going to continue really for the next 2 sessions after that. So this is just the initial step in it. And the goals, when we're dealing with goals with the kids, we're using goals in kind of 2 related but somewhat different senses. So in the sense that's going to matter the most to the kids on a week-to-week basis, they're going to have a goal sheet. And that's going to have a behavior, a goal that's a behavior that's going to be monitored, they can earn points for. In addition, we're going to talk about how these short-term goals that kids have could be, so this is the cue. This is the 5-minute cue, by the way, if any of you see that happening over there. There's a purpose for that. It's not, yeah. Strike one. Okay. Question was back here somewhere, yeah.
Who identifies the goal?
Who identifies the goals? Okay, so there's a whole structure for that. So I can't remember if I got the slide in here on this. So the thing that I recommend is if you're going to be using school-based goals, this is a school group, let's say, and so the goals are really going to be about kids' behavior at school, then before the group begins, before this session occurs, I'm going to meet with each child's teacher. And I'm going to tell the teacher that one of the things we're going to do is that your child is going to, whoever, Jimmy down here, is going to be working on weekly behavioral goals. And that's going to work best if you're going to be able to give him daily feedback on how well he does. And then we want Jimmy to bring that sheet back to group next week. And depending on how he does, he can earn some points in group. So and we emphasize how important this is. The group just won't work very well unless you really do a great job. So you're part of the team, and you try to bring them in to under the tent, and they're part of our group. And then I ask the teacher to begin to create a menu of what some of those behavioral goals could be and should be for Jimmy. So I'd like for this teacher to give me 10 different goals that they think that the child will generate. And as we're going to talk about, we want these to be very behavioral, very observable. Because whenever they tell you something, you have to say, okay, I have to imagine that going up on this goal sheet, and can a human being observe that? Or is it kind of more like, I want them to straighten up or something in class, and unless they mean just like that, that's not very helpful. So you want it to be very observable, concrete. And then after they get maybe 10 or so of these ideas, I want them to go back through the list and say, which are the ones that are probably going to be easiest for Jimmy, and which are the ones that are going to be hardest for Jimmy. And we're going to start with the easiest ones. So I want the teacher to know out of the gate that, in fact, we're not going to go after what the teacher most wants us to go after, but that this is a process. We have to go after the easiest ones and I explain that in that you can explain in shaping terms, but our own experience with this is that those first few weeks are so critical, and if kids can have a success experience on this task, then they maintain motivation to work on it. If they go through 2 or 3 weeks, they've not earned any points, the likelihood of them re-engaging is very low. So I really, really, really want this to work in the first couple of weeks, and that's what I convey. So I've got this list then from the teacher. If I was going to have home-based goals, if I was doing this in a clinic setting or somewhere else, home-based goals, I'd do the same thing but with the parent, right? And in some cases, you actually might do it with both. You get home goals and school goals, that'd be fine. So I've got all that, And then I'm going to meet with the child and ask the child to begin to think of some goals that they could work on. And I want their first goals to be coming from that list that I've heard from the teacher, and I want it to come from the easy goals section. Now, if the child does not come up with goals that are on the teacher list, or only comes up with the hard goals on the teacher list, then I'm going to suggest a goal, which I know is down at the bottom. So my preference, so the sequence here is I want to know the universe of goals. I want the child to ideally select the goal. They're going to be more committed to it if they select it. But if they've not picked a correct or a goal that means anything or it's too hard, then I'm going to push to get the other one. Yeah. Yeah.
What if in a list of goals, let's say there's a very dangerous, like, the child's very, very physically aggressive. Is there any way of maybe picking something that is, like, maybe it's the absolute fixing of the problem is too huge to handle? Can we take that big goal and maybe break it up into achievables for him, and then get so that then, we're kind of addressing that big thing, but he's going to get success. We're gonna break it down.
Right. So the key is if he can get success. I think that's the key. So it might be so hitting. It could even be a goal. So I don't know if this is what you're going for, but you could say something like, this week we're going to go for the first 15 minutes of math class, and if you can avoid hitting during that period of time, then you get to earn your point. So one thing you can adjust with these is time, and that's a big way to adjust it. And for kids who are engaging in high-frequency behaviors, you almost have to do that, or a dangerous behavior like that. Yeah. Okay, this is an example of a goal sheet. Comes from the handout here. So I will keep my hands and feet to myself in the lunchroom. So would that be a good goal? Clear goal, right? Pretty observable. So we would say that's sufficient. That's good. And then we want to have on a daily basis then the teacher, Miss Barth, to indicate whether or not the child succeeded with that goal, keeping my hands and feet to myself in the classroom. So for this particular child, there were 3 days where the child did well, and one day where the child wasn't at school. We want the teacher to tell us that. And then another day where the child had a no, and the teacher actually tells us what happened that day. So 3 out of 5, really 3 out of 4, which isn't too bad. So one of the other rules here is when you have that meeting with your teacher where you're getting your menu for goals, is you want to get the teacher in that case to give you a copy of her autograph. Right? Does this make sense? Okay. So we all know these kids, right? We've been victims of kids forging various things, so we know that. So be proactive. And the other thing we would do, I think, with the goal sheet, just to emphasize, is at the bottom it says, I, John, I'm the kid, have chosen the above goal and am responsible for doing my best to meet this goal and having my teacher sign this sheet daily. So we want this to have the function and the form of a mini contract, contingency contract. And we want the child to be writing in what the goal is. We want the child to sign their name. So as much of this that can be the child, the better. Helps with their involvement.